See, your house is left to you. Through the prayers of God's holy people, may Christ our God have mercy on us and gather us to himself. Amen. This past week, we learned that the Reverend Dr. Lewis Weil had died. He was the professor of liturgics at the Episcopal Seminary over in the East Bay, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and he had held 2 such positions prior to that. He was an impassioned teacher, a brilliant liturgist, a compelling writer. And it might be said that all of us are part of his inheritance. That is, we are his descendants. And what I mean by that is this. This book, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, on which the liturgical life of this place and the entire Episcopal Church is based, he was an influencer of this. I might call him an architect of it. He was an architect of common prayer, and there were 2 ways in his work that this was so beautifully expressed, if I can paraphrase. Number 1, the architecture of our worship space will always win. And by that, I mean this. It's pretty hard to design against the architecture of a neo-Gothic cathedral. At 5'6", I'm not likely to win against this great edifice. But it also means that if we design with the architecture, that the architecture is for us and it is for our common prayer, it augments what it means for us to gather together. Secondly, when it comes to architecture, our liturgy, our common prayer, is about the architecture of our relationships to God and to one another. And the way that that is envisioned in the 1979 prayer book is arising out of baptism, out of Christ's own life of service and self-offering. It is essentially flat. It is this plane. That is our spiritual architecture, the architecture of our prayer. Now, to get to Grace Cathedral, for those of you who are within the church today, less applicable to those of you online, you had to go up. It was either some number of flights of stairs, it was likely a hill or 2, sometimes 3, and it was just like what the people had to do to get up to the temple. There were 12 tribes, and they had to climb the heights of the hills in Jerusalem to go up, to go to the center of cultic life, to go to the Holy of Holies, to land in the court of the Gentiles, where it was that Jesus taught. It was a site of pilgrimage, especially at feasts like the Passover. It was the site of the Levites and the priests who knew temple worship, and it was in proximity, often, but not always, to the kings. We can imagine that the great walls of the city of Jerusalem sometimes preserved that temple from the attacks of its neighbors. We can imagine that in the worst of times, the temple, like the city, was seen more as a fortress to be protected and less as a sign of God's presence and a sanctuary for God's people. I mentioned priests and kings, but we also need to talk about prophets. Prophets, they read and interpreted signs, and their mission was to help God's people course correct, to prompt cultural, social, religious, moral change. Some of our most prolific prophetic literature comes from prophets in exile. I think of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. But there were also prophets in the environs of the temple. They were sometimes, but not always, at tension with the royal and priestly authorities. And let's say especially when their calls for reform troubled the delicate balance of temple and royal power, colonial and international relations. In the absence of First Amendment protections, they could be dismissed. Jesus says, "How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you." As Christians, we claim Jesus as priest, prophet, and king. And in the gospel, according to Luke, which we heard from today, that prophetic dimension has a leading edge. If we recall, in the gospel according to Matthew, we hear this beautiful text called the Beatitudes in a Sermon on the Mount. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." But according to Luke, those Beatitudes are spoken on the plain, and they follow with companion woes. "Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry." That's Jesus the prophet speaking to us. So when we are gathered, as we are today, gathered as a brood, gathered into Christ's body, baptized into his life and ministry, into his death and resurrection, we are also baptized into his prophetic spirit. We are charged with change. The house that is left to us isn't left to us to preserve as a museum, but to continually reform in the direction of right actions, right relationships, equity, and justice in the world. That reform begins in the temple of our own hearts. And in this season of Lent, with the very basic disciplines of prayer and fasting and almsgiving. Of all of these practices, fasting may be the most difficult, and in some ways then the most important. I take it on faith that because you are gathered here, we are all praying together, and we've all given of something to be here. Fasting asks a little bit more of us. It is, as Paul writes in his letter to the Philippians today, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ, and their God is their belly. There are so many good foods that are so widely available here. And it takes nothing for me to wax poetic about yesterday's omelet or this story about this burgeoning food scene in Los Angeles from Lao immigrants who are kind of seizing their own national cuisine for the first time in 2 generations. I mean, my mouth was watering just looking at it. But I venture, we must be put in the more direct and visceral contact with the hungers of the world. And we cannot do that if our bellies are always full. Fasting is not dieting. It may not loosen the fit of our clothing, but it can unlock the fortress of our hearts. It is the flattest and most basic architecture of prayer. Now, Malcolm, maybe I should have asked beforehand to get your blessing to give homework. Can I give homework? I'm going to give homework. This week, in this season of Lent, I want to assign us, invite us, give us the homework of fasting. Do what is appropriate for your body, for your medical needs. But I am persuaded that each of us can abstain sometimes from the food we want so that we can become the food that the world needs. We can abstain sometimes from the things that we want so that we can become what the world needs. See, your house is left to you. Jesus, the prophet, is inviting us into his own life, into one of gathering, reforming, transforming the temple of his own body, the whole household of creation. From the level plane of hunger, there we can take up our prophetic work. It's best known in modern parlance as advocacy, as that overt and public support for more equitable policy and practice. And here at Grace Cathedral, we are committed to becoming advocates. And I invite everyone, whether you're in the Cathedral Church today or praying along online, to develop those capacities for advocacy. They're important to our Christian vocation, and they're very important to our social justice initiative to end slavery for good. It's part of a larger national movement to end legal slavery in prisons. The best way to become an advocate is to attend 2 free Zoom-based trainings that are offered by the Episcopal Public Policy Network. And you can learn more about those trainings by visiting the social justice table at coffee hour or by looking at the URL that is posted on your screen now. See, your house is left to you. Jesus is gathering a prophetic people here more fully and more readily as we prepare to open our doors to pilgrims and visitors throughout the week. But the basic architecture of this city, of this country, of this world protects too many in gilded heights and precludes too many from reaching its gates. Jesus is gathering us as a brood under his wings to feed us with his own presence and to engage our hungers for a holy city built on the plane of equity and justice, built on a plane of peace.